Clapper board, you're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled, "This Alien Warrior Was Left to Die Until the Humans Arrived HFY. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now we begin. The sky above Coral bled in shades of ember and bruise, the sort of color the universe wears when it forgets whether to heal or to kill. Lightning stitched the clouds shut and unmade them again. The land itself steamed, a cracked skillet of obsidian and ash that smelled of iron, insulation, and grief. Where a city had once breathed, a chorus of neon and chant and the steady heart of industry, there knelt only a single figure, wide-shouldered and alone, like a statue that had remembered it was mortal. Vekar of the Thrakel Dominion was born with a name that carried more weight than armor. He had eaten the heart of a great desert prowler in his 10th molt. He had memorized the battle hymns of 7 grandmothers and learned to sleep under the rumble of ship cannons like a lullaby. All of that had meant something in the age before silence. Now it meant only that he endured a little longer with his leg burned open to the bone and his breath counting backward toward zero. His visor was shattered. The world looked like a bad memory through the spiderweb of cracked glass. What vision remained showed him the wreckage of his cohort, a triangle of helmets half sunk in slag, a fallen banner fused into a wall, armor plates warped into lily pads by the splash of a reactor burst. From the ridge a kilometer away, a 3-pronged ship, once a sleepless eagle of the Dominion, lay like a broken wing across the valley. Farther still, a human shuttle burned in blue, stubborn and sad, a candle refusing to accept the size of the night. Vekar flexed fingers that had once snapped bone like reeds. They were numb. He pushed the edge of a collapsed bulkhead aside with a grunt and felt the prickle of hot rain on his bare scales. Black water hissed around him. He listened for the Dominion channel, for the bark of a commander, for the cadence he had known all his life. Only static answered, that hungry animal always chewing at the edges of words. He told himself he would die on his feet. Then his leg told him otherwise, and he smiled, a small, bitter curl of the lip that had no room for pride. He dragged himself 2 body lengths toward the shelter of a ruined transport, leaving a trail that steam filled in behind him like a wound learning to pretend it had never been cut. A streak of light moved low in the sky, carving a patient line between storms. Small, human. They called their rescue craft ghouls. He remembered with the mocking disdain he had once saved for prey. Little ships that went where the big ones were ashamed to look, collecting the left behind, the broken, the things with names that no longer fit. He turned his head and spat dark. Humans scavenged well. It was a talent he had not respected enough. The craft came down on its belly with the sound of a drunk argument and a prayer answered late. 3 figures spilled from its mouth and fanned out, skinny silhouettes against fire, lamb pies bright behind fogged visors. They moved with careful urgency, a contradiction Vekar recognized at once. The small must always be deliberate. That was the first law of surviving giants. Movement, said one voice, young and taut as wire. Keep weapons low, said the second, calm, a stone dropped into a bowl of water. Radiation is spiking, make this quick. The third voice, a woman's, carried neither fear nor contempt. It carried weather old and sure. There, she said, by the lift struts. They found Vekar half-propped on the mangled rib of the transport, his jaws set, each breath a hammered nail. He lifted his hand automatically, palm empty, a soldier's refusal to beg disguised as a promise not to kill. One of them stepped close enough for Vekar to see a face behind the visor, a woman with a straight mouth shaped by decisions. Her eyes were the uncertain blue of morning. "You are enemy," Vekar said, his voice like stone dragged on stone. "You are alive," she answered, and her visor sealed that sentence into the weather. He misjudged her. He was ready for pity and respect, for calculation, for hatred. He was not ready for the simple presence of an answer that did not ask to be measured. She crouched. Her hands moved to his ruined leg without flinch or ceremony. Cool pressure, a hiss of foam, a click of splints. Behind her, the young one kept his rifle trained on the molten horizon, not on Vekar. Already, a choice lived in that angle. "Leave me," Vekar said. He expected to hear himself in those words, the pride and the command, the feral romance of doom. All he heard was an animal that wanted to sleep. "Negative," she said. "Not in our vocabulary. Humans and their vocabulary." He had learned enough of it to despise how their little words wore big coats. He let darkness climb his spine and lower him carefully into it, clutching the sound of rain like a blanket. He woke to the smell of metal gone sterile and the soft grind of a generator preferring to live. A roof existed above him. Walls pretended the sky was an occasional stranger. Machine beeps made a map of time and walked the edges every second, never falling off. A human face leaned over him, not a clinical stare, an inventory. She counted his breaths. She counted the sweat on his brow. She counted the small tremors in muscles that had never been allowed to tremble. She tallied him alive. "Name's Captain Mira Solon," she said, removing her gloves. "Remnant Team Echo, Earthborn, you're safe. Safe." Another human word that tried to pay the bill for what it bought with the same bill. "I am Vekar of Thrakel," he said, "because a name with no title is a door with no house." She nodded once as if making a note. "We stitched what we could. Leg will hold. Don't ask it to dance." He was not yet certain whether to respect how she spoke to him or to punish it, but he lay still. It was not that he trusted. It was that he found himself without choice and grew curious what that felt like when not named shame. Days taught him the shape of Remnant Team Echo's world. They lived inside a skeleton, a Thrakel forward base bent to human scale with patches and hope. The walls held both alien latticework and human welding scars. A Dominion glyph pulsed at the far corridor in the slow heartbeat of a dying god. Human lights ran string-like across ceilings and hummed in the sleep shadow of storms. They had salvaged a kitchen from a refugee ship and a med bay from a science corvette. They had introduced them as friends. There were 5 of them in all. Mira, the captain, shoulders like a beam, voice like morning. Riker, young, dark-eyed, clever, half-raw arrogance and half-raw kindness. He wore both like new boots and got blisters from them. Illa, quiet as a held breath, a mechanic with hands that understood wounded metal without translation. Pasha, a pilot who hummed old songs into his controls. He had learned to land where no landing existed because his life kept insisting on it. Sarai, a medic with a laugh too bright for a war zone. She trimmed it to fit and didn't apologize. They did not keep Vekar bound. He was not foolish enough to think this meant trust. Chains were heavy, and they had no extra weight to spend. They kept a rifle leaning where a hand could find it. They kept a quiet pact in their eyes that said if violence came, it would arrive as a team effort and leave ashamed. Vekar's body healed as all true warriors hate to heal. Slowly and with the sort of pain that seems needless until it finishes, and you realize it taught you something you had refused to learn. He could limp by the 2nd week. He could stand a watch shift by the 3rd. He could shut his eyes and not see fire by the 4th. He ate their food, it tasted like tin, tasted remembrance of trees, and drank their water, it tasted like the aftersigh of clouds. He watched them repair a generator with the caution and tenderness of swaddling a newborn. He listened to their jokes, the lightness that scandalized ruin by surviving under it. Once he asked Mira, "Why do your kind laugh where there is no victory?" She cleaned a coil gun and answered as if the question were honest and not a bruise. "Because loss is loud, we laugh to hear ourselves again." Another time, when a night wind rattled the patched walls and the sky wore teeth, he asked, "Why did you save me? We killed your settlements on Eridine. We left your dead unburied on Tash." She did not look away. "Because we don't leave people, or because we want to be the kind of people who don't leave people." Sometimes the reason is the training, sometimes it's the dream. He tasted that. It was spiced with contradiction and chewed like bread, but the planet didn't notice their philosophy. A second storm season arrived. This one carried machines that had lost their purpose and had been adopted by hunger instead. They came out of the fog with insect patience, multi-limbed scavengers, eyes an ugly blue, joints jerking like stuttered prayer. They sought heat. The echo base offered it. Vekar stood on the wall with Riker the first night the scavengers tested the fence. The young human cradled his rifle and kept looking sideways at Vekar as if bracing for an accusation he'd already decided to deserve. "You hate me," Riker said finally, as the rain came in curtains so thick it looked like the world had blinked. "No," Vekar said simply, "you hate what I am." "You are young," Vekar replied. "That is a crime the years themselves forgive." Riker snorted, which in his mouth meant thanks. "You ever gonna tell us why the great Thrackle left you bleeding in the dirt?" "Because I bled," Vekar said, and the truth threw its shadow across both of them. The scavengers hit like a broken clock, all the hands in the wrong places, all the ticks too close together. Illa's turret purred, Mira's orders cracked, Sarai's hands ran blood like a ledger and balanced it. Vekar pulled a plate of a dead war machine from the yard, strapped it to his forearm, and went over the wall. Riker cursed and followed because the worst thing a young soldier can do is let an old one be braver. In rain that bit, in light that stuttered, they fought. Vekar slammed his shield plate into metal skulls and felt jaws break like brittle tokens. He stamped on joint work and heard the language of screws complain. He learned the geometry of their bodies. Crush there, slice there, twist there, and the bright coil inside sobs and dies. Human rounds hammered, human hands steadied, human breath refused to run out. They held. After Mira found Vekar sitting with his back to a cracked wall and his breath dressed like laughter though it was only exhaustion. She crouched and pressed a water tube into his hand. He took a swallow and stared at the sky while it still remembered how to rain. "You fight like someone who doesn't believe in survival," she said. "I fight like someone who hates debt," he answered. "You carried me when I weighed more than I deserved." She tilted her head, a smile in a low-pulse version. "We'll add it to your job description." Vekar, shield, hammer, accountant. What is an accountant? Someone who tells the dead their taxes are paid. He considered. A holy profession. They laughed then together, and the ruined base listened the way a room listens when it watches a habit being born. Months took the shape of rituals. Morning, check the filters, count the rations, test the fence. Afternoon, salvage runs in pairs, never alone, into the teeth of a land that had been convinced it was an ocean full of sharp stones. Evening, catalog what returned, mourn what did not. Night, stories if they had the breath, silence if they had the need. The stars showed up when they could to remind the ground it was smaller than it felt. On the 91st day of being almost a team, Pasha picked a signal out of the soup of radiation and distance, a little bead of voice on a necklace of static. He coaxed it closer with hands and will. Remnant echo, any human frequencies, colony ship wayfarer, gridlock in debris ring, have your beacon requesting flare. The base stood still in the kind of silence that only good news creates, the flinch before hope touches skin. Mira leaned over the console. "Wayfarer, this is echo. Flare impossible. Power rationed. We can triangulate." She listed coordinates like a spell. Pasha looked like a son seeing a parent at a station platform. Riker smiled with his whole face and then restrained it, embarrassed by its size. Vekar watched them. Something in him had the ache of a tight not being tricked by warmth into loosening. Rescue meant departure. Departure meant the end of an experiment he had not consented to and had grown to prefer. But the universe is too proud to let moments ripen. On the morning Wayfarer promised approach, the sky stitched itself with fire from a craft that bore his people's mark. Thrackle dropships cut the clouds like knives deciding the portion. They weren't a rescue party. Their landing signature told any soldier who read it. They had come to finish a story with fire and a report that used the words cleansed and regrettable collateral. Vekar stood at the wall and tasted metal. His scales prickled. The war inside him rose, that old animal that wanted to reach for the easiest version of himself and unzip it. Mira stepped to his side, eyes narrow, mouth an angle that meant she had seen a problem she refused to let be only a problem. "Yours," Riker said, half accusation, half fear, all youth. "Yes," Vekar said, "and not." The Thrakel commander approached with 40 soldiers arranged in two neat insults. He wore a helm with tusks carved from the bones of something that had thought itself unkillable. He removed it slowly to let his face do the rest of the talking, scar like a river delta, eyes like coins no longer in circulation, a mouth that preferred to issue orders than to drink. "Vekar," he said, and in that sound there was a history of drills, of shared oaths shouted over music that sounded like artillery. "They told us you were decoration for the crows." "Crows do not land on hot metal," Vekar said. "I remained inconvenient." The commander's gaze slid to the human captain and back like a blade checking two pieces of meat. "You live with vermin." "They live with me," Vekar corrected. "You disappoint the bones of your grandmothers." "Then let them stir," Vekar said softly, like a hand under a river. The commander motioned. His soldiers stepped forward with the ease of a chore. Mira's crew lifted rifles but held them at the line between warning and war. "We are cleansing this sector," the commander said, ritual and law braided in his voice. "There must be no witnesses to our retreat, no evidence of our doubt." "Then you came to the wrong place," Mira said. The commander almost smiled. It was the expression of a predator who finds the prey tastes brave and wonders if that will improve the meat. He gave the order. The first shots kissed dust and drew blood, and the world made the old sound again, the sound that says, "Here is the only language we bother to master and forget." Vekar moved without permission from anyone alive. He leaped from the wall into the heated breath of conflict with the certainty of a believer and the rage of a man reading an old scripture and discovering it lied. He took the first Thrakel soldier's shot on his armor and broke the second shoulder with his elbow and the third's jaw with the butt of a stolen rifle. Riker's round stitched the sand at his side. Illa's turret complained in elegant bursts. Sarai dragged Pasha out of a corridor, already convincing itself it was a grave. The commander came toward Vekar in the manner of men who trust their place in a story. Plasma blade in hand, helmet glinting, history behind his eyes, a whole choir of dead singing that he was right. The duel was the kind of beauty pain wears when it's sick of apologizing. Vekar had grown heavier in months, not fat, not dull, but weighted by gratitude and the terrible lightness of laughing with people who should be enemies. He fought like a wall made mobile, like an oath that had found boots. The commander fought like thunder taught to aim. They traded cuts that smoked and parried old lessons. Around them, the human line bent but didn't break. Mira's orders hammered rhythm into chaos and gave it something to dance to. Twice, Sarai stood in a doorway with nothing but a med pack and a glare, and convinced a soldier to die elsewhere. Pasha ran the shuttle like it was a blade. Illa was in engine room given a rifle. The commander scored Vekar's ribs. Vekar answered by cutting gently across the commander's thigh, not a killing blow, a reminder. The commander's eyes flickered with anger's old friend, shame. "You are Thrakel," he spat. "Remember." "I remember," Vekar said, and he heard Mira's laugh burn like a small hearth at the edge of memory. "I remember being left." The Thrakel commander roared that sacred syllable. He brought his plasma down. Vekar stepped inside the ark, as if nodding yes to a question no one dared ask, and drove his blade under the commander's ribs and up and out into the sky. For an instant, night flickered in the commander's eyes, surprise at the insult of mortality. And then there was only the thud of heavy belief making contact with the ground. The rest paused because the body of a leader is a punctuation mark in any language. Vekar planted a foot on the dead man's chest and lifted his head toward those still alive. "Leave," he said. "Take your fear and your orders and the shadow of your pride and go. There is nothing left of the Dominion here worth killing." "Traitor," a soldier said with the sincerity of prayer. "Witness," Vekar corrected, "to what we could have been." They left, not quickly, not in panic, in that slow, careful way warriors manage when they do not want to admit they have been spared. Silence afterward carried heavy buckets of breath and spilled most of it. Mira sat on the broken step, blood wet on her sleeve, and met Vekar's gaze as if they had been having a conversation paused by war and now resumed. "You chose," she said. "I remembered," he said. "They moved then because moving is the only sacred thing left to do when the dead have been counted. They reinforced walls and burned the bodies when the rites demanded flame. They reset the beacon. They waited for the wayfarer, and the seconds, as always, took their time forgiving them. Rescue did arrive, flying like the first true story a child hears and believes just enough. The wayfarer hovered above ruin and lowered its gangway like a hand to a drowning friend. Human crews spilled out with blankets and questions and the solemnity of logistics. They made lists. They made faces when lists were ugly. They lifted children of other colonies from bedrolls strangers had woven. They handed out water in the precise quantities that hope requires and waste forbids. Vekar stood a little apart. He had grown used to the smell of this small tribe and did not know if he could breathe in a bottle of ship air that had learned to forget the taste of fire. Riker came to stand with him and did not fill the air with words. Finally, the young man said, "You coming?" "I do not belong," Vekar said. Riker looked at his own boots, a faint grin ghosting. "None of us did at first. Then we did." Mira approached, exhaustion arranged carefully so as not to frighten those who still needed her strength. She studied Vekar. "We're heading to the Wayfarer, then to the Helio corridor, then to the ragged edge of something like home. You don't have to answer now. But we can't leave you here like furniture made of regret." He felt the old language rise, dignity, lineage, oath. Another language spoke at the same time, mornings checking filters together, rain fought as a team, laughter that had no right to exist and did anyway. He listened to both and decided to be bilingual. "I will come," he said, and tasted fear and relief in equal portions like a balanced meal. On the Wayfarer, Vekar learned new corridors, new rituals. The ship smelled of citrus clean, oil, the acid sweet of printer resins, the sackcloth that blankets wear after many washings. He bent his head through doorways until mechanics learned to raise the frames. He ate at a far table until crewmen realized distance tastes worse and began to sit near. Children dared him into games until parents pretended not to encourage it. Sarai traded med lore with the ship's dock. Illa disappeared into engine spaces and returned grinning. Pasha fell in love with a machine and demanded it love him back. Riker argued with everyone about things that could be better and set to work proving it. The galaxy, in the meantime, continued its habit of assigning homework. The debris field at the edge of the system was a broken rosary of ships, station ribs, mine heads, and the baked-in refuse of a fleet that had eaten itself. The Wayfarer needed to pass through. Dominion ghosts still haunted the carcasses of torpedo frigates and missile nests. The field's automatic defenses woke slowly as the ship approached, like old soldiers with bad backs recognizing the smell of command and rising anyway. Defensive Matrix Live warned the Wayfarer's security chief, a woman with a scar that had chosen to be honest rather than dramatic. "We can't punch, we have families aboard." "Thread the eye," Mira said from the auxiliary station. "We will not be here again, do it right." The Wayfarer danced to the extent a carrier the size of shame can dance. It slid between hulks that still wanted to be mountains, flashed past tethers that were glad to be nooses, and argued politely with drones that refused to admit the war had ended. Vekar stood at a viewport and watched their path carve a sentence into ruin. We persist. The drones learned. They gathered. They came with a noise like the anger of flies and the focus of men finally given permission. The Wayfarer could kill, yes. It had teeth, but every bite meant collateral flesh. The crew hesitated. Vekar did not. He turned from the viewport and found Mira already looking at him. She nodded in the way commanders nod when the unspoken has applied for parole and been granted it. They took a shuttle, ugly and brave, the sort of skiff that has learned to tell its own story because no one else will. Vekar piloted with Pasha. Mira and Riker manned the guns. Illa fed the engine's sweet lies. They lured the drones wide. A bright irritation pulled away from delicate skin and slammed through the field toward a dead Dominion control barge that still wore a crown of antennas. "Those drones need a mother," Mira said between gut-clenched breaths. "We cut the tether, we quiet the swarm." "The barge will be armored," Vekar said. "Good," she answered grimly. "I hate easy problems." They clipped the barge and landed hard in a birth canal of twisted metal and ash. Inside smelled like the hungers of men who had run out of enemies and turned on their ghosts. The corridors were choked with automatic turrets that had died in arguments with vacuum. The navigation console was a ribcage around a dead star. At its heart, the control core slept beneath a shell of memory. Vekar placed his hand against the core. The language that woke was Thrackle. Sharp consonants, proud vowels, an alphabet drilled into his bones like the pattern of teeth. He whispered command phrases in a voice that made Riker's hair rise and Mira stand very still. He told the machines they had done well, that the Empire was finished, that rest was not defeat. He told them, with the authority of belief, that the time had come to lay down and let the living build. The core argued. The code insisted. The drones rattled the hull and asked in bullets whether perhaps they should continue a little longer. Vekar lowered his forehead to the core and remembered heat and bone altars and the smell of his mother's forge. He remembered the taste of the day he had laughed with humans for the first time and noticed the laugh had not tasted like betrayal. He found the place in the code where pride had been hammered in too eagerly, and he unbent it with his voice. The drones slowed. A hesitation shivered through the swarm. Pasha whooped into the comm like a boy seeing his first carnival. Riker braced at the hatch, rifle ready, eyes bright with the kind of fear that doesn't waste time with denial. Mira watched Vekar and said nothing because there are moments when words are the wrong tool for the job. "Sleep," Vekar told the machines again. "I release you." They obeyed like good soldiers. Discovering it is a relief to stop obeying. The Wayfarer slid through the corridor the drones had guarded and emerged into the clean insistence of stars that have kept their appointments for longer than empires can name. The ship sent up a cheer like bread rising, slow, warm, satisfying. The shuttle returned to a bay that smelled like fuel and relief. Later, on the observation deck where children pressed their noses to glass and wrote their names on fog with fingers, Mira stood beside Vekar. The light of a near sun made their shadows certain. "You keep saving us," she said. "I am learning to repay," he answered. She shook her head. "That's not how saving works." "Then what is it?" "Practice," she said, "for who we want to be." He looked at her profile, the way her strength did not demand apology, the way her fatigue wore itself openly, the way her mouth held the hint of a smile even when there was no reason. He had been trained his whole life to read strength as possession. This was strength as offering. "Your species," he said slowly, as if tasting the idea for poison and finding none, "does not conquer lands as much as it conquers endings. You refuse to let a story stop. It is irritating." "Good," she said, and at last that half-smile became an honest one. "We try to be." Not all endings could be delayed. Some arrived even if refusal prepared a bed beside the door to persuade them otherwise. Near the Helio corridor, a Thrakel cruiser intercepted not with fire but with broadcast. The message that bled into every receiver was the sound of an empire forgetting how to pretend. It offered terms seasoned with old arrogance and new worry. "Return Vekar," said the voice of a chancellor who had never dirtied his hands except with signatures. "He is ours," Mira answered with a stillness that sounded more final than any gun. "He is his." The cruiser drew closer. Its weapons remained silent. From its belly, a shuttle launched and took a straight path to the Wayfarer's banded light. The Wayfarer did not shoot it down. It landed in the bay with exquisite politeness. The hatch opened. An elder Thrakel stepped out, scales dulled to a beautiful matte by time, eyes patient, scars arranged like a library rather than a boast. He leaned on no king. His breath did not labor. He carried the smell of cold stone and ash left to cool, of prayers aged until they stopped needing words. He met Vekar in the middle of the bay as if it were a road in a village neither of them had been to but both remembered. He looked long, nodded once. "You still stand tall," the elder said. "I learned from small teachers," Vekar replied. The elder's mouth did a thing Vekar had not seen on a Thrakel in a long time. It softened. "You were left, an error we will sing apologies for until the song grows old." "The apology is accepted," Vekar said, and then added, surprising himself as much as the elder, "as long as it does not end a conversation that should continue." The elder's gaze wandered to Mira as if he had already known her name before seeing her. "Your kind confuses us," he admitted. Mira regarded him with the compassion one gives an honest question. "We confuse ourselves. It's how we grow." Elder bowed a fraction to Vekar. "Come home." Vekar felt the old word under his tongue like a coin rubbed by countless fingers. It had once purchased everything. It now bought little compared to the thing beside him, this human ship, this crew, this way of holding together. Home was no longer a place, it was a practice. "I will visit," he said. "I will bring news, I will argue, I will teach what I have learned if you will not call it treason. We will call it experiment," the elder said, which in a people who loved conclusions more than questions counted as a revolution. Vekar clasped the elder's forearm in the old grip. They were both careful not of hurting, but of breaking something too new to understand. The elder departed. The cruiser left without demanding or firing or giving. The Wayfarer breathed. The corridor beyond the stars welcomed them. On its far side, a scattering of human colonies in various stages of heartbreak and rebuilding sent up pings of joy as the Wayfarer announced itself like a pilgrim returning with good stories and enough bread to share. Weeks became months again, but these months grew vegetables in hydroponics and taught songs to children and filled the air with argument about schools versus shipyards, about the balance between remembering and moving on. Humanity understood that rebuilding is not construction alone. It is also permission to dream in the direction of a day with no alarms. Vekar worked in the ship's forge and found his breathing matched the bellows. He crafted tools, not blades. He mended hull plates. He taught Riker how to listen to metal, and Riker taught him how human cursing can sometimes persuade a bolt to obey. He told stories to children in the cargo bay, carefully edited epics in which monsters learned to plant seeds and heroes asked for help. He sparred with shipguards in the gym and let himself lose sometimes, because it is a lesson all leaders must rehearse for when a day comes where losing with dignity saves more lives than winning with hunger. He walked often with Mira. They discussed policy and songs, and the precise number of seconds a person can watch a sunrise before memory interferes. They stood sometimes at viewing windows through which a planet wore a necklace of storms and said nothing until silence did the speaking and they nodded to honor it. Loss is never paid off. It is rebudgeted. A fever hit the outer colonies in the second year, a cough with an ugly idea of ambition. The wayfarer became a hospital and a messenger. Sarai slept 3 hours out of every 40 and stole minutes from kindness to give to science. Vekar carried crates and people, and sometimes, when the weight was not his to lift, simply carried time by listening to mothers cry. Mira's orders became lullabies and threats in equal measure, depending on whether a door needed to open or stay shut. Riker built a sterilizer out of a food processor and became briefly unbearable about it until Illa threw a rag at his head. They endured. They were shaped. A small Thrakel envoy visited during that plague and offered medicine engineered from a plant that only grew on worlds the Empire had conquered by being the first to ask. Humans accepted the medicine. They shared art and recipes. They traded the word for thank you and kept both versions. Riker fell in love with a Thrakel linguist and learned the hard way that communication does not equal harmony but certainly helps. The two species learned to argue without reaching for a blade. In the 3rd year, a pirate fleet assembled from the leftovers of a collapsing power tried the old trick: steal what is healing because it's busy being gentle. They came like hyenas to a watering hole and found elephants. The wayfarer and a half-dozen ships that had once carried refugees and now carried armor rose to meet them. The battle that followed was not legendary. It was clean, necessary, bold. Vekar boarded a pirate corvette and met eyes with a captain who had mistaken desperation for permission. He disarmed him with a sigh. Mira's voice held the line. The pirates left poorer in guns and richer in ideas about what they might be if they had someone worth obeying. Vekar traveled once to a Thrakel world whose mountains wore the sin of history in stripes, and whose cities grew like patient crystals. He stood before councils that had grown old, choking on certainty, and spoke of humans who make homes out of the refuse of wars and call those homes schools, hospitals, gardens, boats. He told them that the galaxy did not need victors. It needed caretakers. Some listened. Some didn't. But the room smelled different when he left, like dust had been asked to dance. On the day the first memorial for the Coral dead was unveiled, humans and Thrakel stood together under a sky gentle enough to be trusted with names. The monument was simple, a wall of stone and alloy hammered until it reflected faces. No lists, no divisions. People looked into themselves to see who they mourned. Mira spoke with the weather in her voice. Vekar placed his palm on the stone and felt the cool confidence of it. Children ran between legs and wrote their own names on the dust because they understood that survival must be documented in mischief. Years later, when the wayfarer moved on to the outer dark to map and befriend and refuse the easy temptation of empire, Vekar stood once more at a viewport. Mira joined him without fanfare. They were older in the way that makes lines into maps and not warnings. "Do you miss war?" she asked, not because she thought the answer would be yes, but because she respected the question. "No," he said, and then honest. "Sometimes I miss the clarity of being told who to be." She nodded. "We make our own orders now. Harder." "Better," he said, and watched a comet draw an exclamation mark across a text too large to read. In the years that followed, many stories wore their names lightly. An orbital farm that fed a dozen worlds grew fruit in the shape of reconciliations no one expected to taste. A school taught Thrakel children the human habit of asking why twice and laughing on the second one. A human poet learned to carve Thrakel glyphs so elegantly the old priests forgot to be insulted and learned instead to hire her for festivals. There were setbacks, of course: fever, border skirmishes, the petty rot that grows under any flag if not aired. They faced them as a team, because that was the habit that had chosen them and that they chose back over and over, even when it cost. On an ordinary wintering day in the ship year calendar, Vekar found a little notebook in the observation deck where children liked to pretend gravity was a pet that could be taught tricks. In it, a child, human, had drawn a big figure, and a smaller one holding hands under a star that had been insisted upon with too much crayon. Underneath this artwork, letters marched like little proud soldiers performing imperfectly but earnestly for a parent. Vekar and Mira and me, saved. He did not show it to Mira. He did not need to. He tucked it into the forge where he kept objects that reminded him not to make swords when a shovel would do. He thought then, not for the first time, that perhaps the gods were merely the names we gave the moments we refused to walk past without bowing. On a not ordinary day late in the 8th year, as the wayfarer threaded the blind creases of a dust sea hunting for a station rumored to be equal parts library and church, a distress call kissed their hull. It came in halting tones from a species too new to ships to be properly afraid of them yet. Pirates, fire, boarders, children hiding in air ducts, the kind of call that miracles practice on. Mira looked at Vekar. Vekar looked at Mira. They said nothing. They didn't need to. The wayfarer turned. The crew moved. A shuttle detached like a promise. They found a freighter bleeding and a cluster of gnats with teeth feeding on it. The gnats saw the wayfarer and became fleas on a war dog. They tried to leap. The wayfarer showed them how honest gravity is in such matters. Vekar boarded the freighter with a team that had rehearsed improvisation into a muscle memory. They removed predators from corridors. They escorted children whose eyes had not yet decided what to do with this new word terror. They sat them in a mess hall and gave them soup because soup is holy when the world has just tried to tip you out of itself. Mira negotiated with the pirate leader over an open channel and took everything from him except his crew and their chance to be better. Sarai put a hand on the freighter captain's shoulder and taught her how to breathe again. When quiet finally arrived, Vekar found a small child scales a soft gray-blue like morning stones under a console chewing a piece of wire as if it were courage. He crouched and offered 2 fingers, large and scarred. The child looked at them, at his face, at his eyes, and accepted, small hand, strong grip. "Does it end?" the child asked. The voice was high and very serious. "The bad, sometimes," Vekar said. "Sometimes it pauses. Sometimes we make it very tired." "Are you a monster?" the child said, and the question was simply scientific. Observation in the service of a hypothesis. "I was," Vekar said. "I am practice." The child nodded, satisfied that the universe still allowed such sentences to exist, and climbed onto his arm with the solemnity of a comet boarding a mountain. Mira watched from a doorway and let her mouth do that rare, small smile that meant the world had done something decent, and she was not going to call attention to it because that might scare it away. They delivered the freighter to a port that had learned to be generous without needing to be rich. They took nothing as payment except a story to tell later and the right to visit. The wayfarer carried on into the dark, carving routes that did not exist the day before, riding an atlas in footsteps and repairs and the soft stubbornness of people who keep finding reasons to try. Years became a way of being. Vekar, once a monument to an empire's certainty, became a road marker pointing toward a gentler weather. Mira, once a captain whose stripes were embroidered by survival, became a way stations in human hearts. Stop here, rest, leave stronger. The crew changed as crews must. Some stayed. Some founded farms on worlds that had not yet learned the difference between silence and peace. Some died because that is the tax the cosmos charges for letting us touch things that matter. Their names were read before meals for a while, then before sleep for longer. Then on the anniversary of the day the wayfarer decided to be a church when it needed to be. Vekar never fully explained to the Thrakel councils why humanity worked. He did not have to. He simply brought them to the edge of a field where children of a dozen worlds bundled in thick coats chased a ball while parents drank 2 hot drinks and shouted advice to physics. He said, "Observe." He brought them to a hospital where machines hummed lullabies and nurses cussed kindly, and a patient just out of surgery asked if the nurse had eaten. He said, "Listen." He brought them to a dock where ships of different flags argued joyfully about who would carry whose cargo for the least profit, because the real payment was friendship that let you call at midnight. He said, "Learn." When the story returned to Coral, because stories love returning, it did so without the smell of burning, and with the sound of hammers used in acts that do not require screaming. The walls of the old base were taken down stone by stone, alloy by alloy, and reused to build a school that taught languages to people who did not yet know they were not enemies. The ground that remembered blood remembered water again. Trees allowed, then invited. Someone painted on a rebuilt wall a messy mural of two figures, one tall with shoulders like a door frame, one wiry with eyes like dawn, holding a rope that pulled a sun upward. The dedication ceremony occurred under a sky that had chosen blue. Mira spoke in short sentences on purpose, so that the words would fall into people's pockets and be found later as talismans. Vekar spoke in his own language, and in human, and in the awkward, graceful blend of both that had become his native tongue. Children sang a song that fit badly and beautifully into several tempos at once. The elder Thrackle, who had once invited Vekar home, stood very straight and clapped very carefully, and experienced the rare joy of being proud of a thing he had not planned. That night, by a small fire, Vekar and Mira sat with the kind of silence that recognizes itself in friends and forgives. Stars swam. The galaxy rotated, uninterested but available. The world smelled like cooling stone and first growth after a burn. "Do you ever regret not letting me die?" Vekar asked finally, his tone more threat than challenge. "Sometimes," Mira said deadpan. "When you snore," he huffed, which had once been a threat and now was a door humans understood as invitation. "No," she said, softer, "not for a breath. Saving you saved parts of us we needed. You taught us to be the kind of people we wanted to believe we were. That's rare." "You taught me to try to deserve it," he replied. They sat a while longer. Somewhere Sarai laughed at something Riker did that was both brilliant and stupid. Somewhere Illa tucked a blanket around Pasha where he had fallen asleep on a crate. Somewhere a child asked a question that made a room wiser by answering. The wind shifted. Vekar lifted his head and sniffed, an old habit from an older life. "Rain," he said. "Tomorrow," Mira answered. He nodded. "Good, the roots will need it." He stood then, slow and without apology for the ache of old wounds negotiated with new uses. He offered Mira his hand. She took it. They walked back toward the lights, toward the speech they would not give, toward the work waiting in the morning. The fire watched them leave and did not feel abandoned because it knew there were other nights it would be asked to tell its stories, and it would oblige gladly. If there is a moral, it is a poor one, because good morals fit badly into the size of real life. But if a listener needs a sentence, let it be this. Sometimes the universe leaves a warrior to die and calls it discipline. Sometimes humans arrive and call it a beginning. The truth sits somewhere between, smiling. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.